Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT Show. I'm John Drummond, and I'm your host for the next 60 minutes. And there'll be interesting minutes. As always on this show, we strive to inform, educate, and entertain wherever we can. So that makes us 300 million times better than BBC Scotland, because that's the size of their budget versus the size of ours. Though I'm happy to say that many of you, in fact, 10,000 of you, have signed up for the Indy Live YouTube facility, your subscribers. And you get all that for less than £3 a month. And you get all the Indy Live material at your desktop or wherever you happen to be, whichever device you're using at the time. So that's available to you anywhere in the world at any time for less than £3 a month. Compare that with 300 million. Which is roughly the size of the BBC Scotland budget. So you can see you're getting a real bargain. Well, as I often say, this has been a great day for British democracy. We learned tonight, for instance, from a whistleblower at the Department of Work and Pensions, that they reckon that 400,000 people may lose their sickness and disability benefits shortly. And listen to this. Their degree of disability or sickness will not be determined by a doctor or a medical assistant or even the doctor's secretary. It will be decided instead by civil servants who presumably will have targets to meet, i.e., we need to spend as little as possible on as many as possible. It seems to me that's a recipe for disaster, absolute disaster. And the notion that people who are vulnerable should be put in jeopardy leading up to Christmas is just an unspeakable act, particularly when I tell you the following, that £136 billion is the size of the overrun at Sellafield, i.e. there's a nuclear reprocessing plant not far from the Scottish border in which the overrun, not the budget, the overrun is £136 billion. I mean, it's hard to credit. It's hard to credit. Why would you freeze pensioners and starve pensioners when you have an overrun of 136 billion? Now, granted, you may not be able to realise all of that, but let's just say you only got a tenth of it. It would still be billions of pounds available to pensioners. I mean, it's outrageous. It's truly outrageous. And let me tell you another startling fact that was publicised today. Scurvy. Do you remember reading in history books and stuff about scurvy? Scurvy is back. Scurvy is back in the UK. Well, certainly in England, according to the reports. It's a condition that is caused by the lack of vitamin C. And you may recall, again from your history books, that it was an endemic problem in the Royal Navy until some bright spark, presumably a doctor, said, look, if you give folks lemons, limes and oranges, you can get rid of this particular condition. And it was a great success. It's back. It's back. Why? Because people can't afford to buy anything with vitamin C in it. This is not a third world country. This is not a third world country we're talking about. This is Great Britain. I mean, it's beyond me. Anyway, there we are. Civil servants will decide who's sick and who's not. And we'll have all sorts of other, I'm sure, even more heinous measures in the pipeline as they come through. So, without any further ado, I would like to introduce our guest tonight. It's Andy Anderson. And Andy will be talking to us about demanding our UN rights. Good welcome, Andy. How are you?
I'm fine.
Good. I'm so glad you could join us tonight. Where are you joining us from?
From home. I'm at home.
Yes. Does your home have a name?
Yes. I'm in Ardrossan.
Ardrossan.
In Ardrossan. And
lovely.
I live in Sorby Road, 63 Sorby Road.
Lovely. And what's the weather like in Ardrossan tonight? What's the weather like in Drummond tonight?
It's dry in any event. It's dry.
That's good. Well, it's always nice to be dry. You can't always be terribly warm, but it's nice if it's dry. What did you think of what I just told the viewing TNT viewers and subscribers tonight?
Well, at one time I used to be surprised by what the British government did, but nowadays I'm not at all surprised by the absurdity of their economic situation. I studied economics myself, and it's one of my main topics that I write about. So I find it absurd that the position of the British government at the moment.
But they're absurd, but let's move from absurdity to common sense then. Tell us about the, as you've coined it, the demanding our UN rights. Tell us what that is and what it is precisely you're demanding, Andy.
Yeah, well, that came from that headline was because I'm speaking about that at a meeting of the pensioners in Glasgow on Friday. But my involvement is with the Respect Scottish Sovereignty, a group that we just set up. And what we're doing is actually we're looking at this question of everybody tells us that they accept that the Scottish people are sovereign and that the sovereign power in Scotland is the people, the rest of the people. The problem is that people don't have any way of expressing that ability to express that sovereignty is crushed. And it doesn't necessarily have to be, because in the United Nations, following the Second World War and the setting up of the human rights legislation, they passed several acts about human rights, and one of them was the civil and political rights, which the British government signed up to in 1967.
Yeah,
we've had that legislation, we've had that right in theory since that time, and that's a right which gives the people the right to direct democracy as well as parliamentary democracy, which would mean things like the people having a referendum on issues which you thought were important. That's contained within that legislation accepted by the British government.
So I'm reading the Articles of the Covenant now. Is it the Covenant you're referring to?
It's the Covenant, yes. It's the Covenant.
Article 1 says it recognises the right of all peoples to self-determination, including the right to, quotes, freely determine their political status, close quotes.
Yes.
Pursue their economic, social and cultural goals and manage and dispose of their own resources.
Yes. And Article 25 gives, specifically refers to direct democracy and equates it with parliamentary democracy. Okay. So if that convention was applied in Scotland today, and there's no reason why it shouldn't be, because the Scottish government have the power to put it into legislation in Scotland.
Yeah.
They have that power under the existing Scotland Act. Now, if they used that power and put it into legislation in Scotland, it would mean that the Scottish people would be able to exercise their sovereign power. In a way.
Have you tested this with lawyers, Andy?
Well, yes. Well, our position there is very similar to the position of the Scottish Human Rights Commission, and presumably they tested it with lawyers, and their position is the same as us on that. As far as lawyers are concerned, I was involved in the Skye Bridge campaign for a very long time. 9 years we were involved in that campaign. All the lawyers told us, even the lawyers that were sympathetic to us, but all the lawyers that we discussed it with told us we couldn't possibly win, but we did. So I'm not particularly impressed with legal visions of the future. But if you read the Act itself, the Scotland Act, I've had a look at it myself, and it looks pretty clear to me, particularly Schedule 5, Part 1, which deals with reserved powers. And subsection 2 of that makes it perfectly clear that any human rights legislation which has been passed by the United Nations and accepted by the UK is not subject to reserved powers.
Really?
It says so in that section of the legislation. So my reading of that is that in that case, and not only my reading, but obviously the Human Rights Commission's reading is the same, because they take the same view, that the Scottish Government has the power to implement this and to put it into Scottish law. They did that in actual fact just last year with the rights of the child, which is a similar convention of the UN. And they put that in, and it's now in Scottish law, and it means that children in Scotland are protected by domestic law in Scotland in a way that children in England and Wales are not, because it's not being put through into English law. But it is UK law. It is acceptable in international law.
Okay, so what's the reaction of the Scottish Government been to this?
Hiding, I think, is the answer to that. We've written to the First Minister, and we've followed that up with a further letter, and we've had not a word back of response. So I don't know what the reaction is. The reaction is that they're not prepared to respond or discuss the issue.
Maybe he's terribly busy just now. But luckily we have a Constitution Secretary. Have you been in touch with him?
Well, at the moment, we're attempting to put a petition to the Parliament, because at the end of the day, it's for the whole of the MSPs to get involved in this.
Yes.
We're attempting to get a petition to the Parliament. That has been blocked initially, and we're still in some discussion with the committee that vet the applications for a petition. They say that they're not clear precisely what we want the Parliament to do, and B, that it may well be in breach of the Scotland Act. It's clearly not in breach of the Scotland Act, and we're pursuing that with them. So yes, we're trying to get this issue debated and we've written to MSPs and discussed it with them. We're trying to get this issue raised, because the Scottish Parliament, if it can't do that, if it can't provide for the Scottish people what they're already entitled to under the United Nations under United Nations conditions, then what the hell can they do? If they can't do that within their own Parliament, particularly when it's quite clear that the Scotland Act doesn't prevent them from doing so.
We've had a number of people obviously in touch. We've got a very animated and interested audience, as you know, for the TNT show, and they're not shy about coming forward if they have a point of view. And one of the comments tonight from several people is, well, this sounds like much the same as Salvo are doing. Does that sound familiar to you?
There is a lot of similarity to the position that we're in, because we're also asking people to sign a proclamation as Salvo's do, which is very similar. And of course, the history is similar. So if we're looking at the history of Scotland, then we come up with a very similar position. The difference is, as far as Salvo is concerned, as far as I understand it, and I've discussed it with people from Salvo, as far as I understand it, they are pursuing the issue through the International Court.
Okay.
We think that this is a matter that should be dealt with in Scotland, in the Scottish Parliament.
Okay, another point that's been raised by several people is, while it's true that the legislation on the rights of the child was, in fact, transacted at the Scottish Parliament, it had to be modified, apparently, in order to satisfy the UK Parliament.
Well, I understand that, but what's interesting to me is it's not clear to me what this modification was. It's not a modification of it can't be a modification of the convention itself, because that's an international treaty. So it couldn't have been that. I think perhaps, as I understand it, it was that it only applies to Scotland and not to England and Wales, because it was the UK Supreme Court, so-called, that dealt with this. The UK Supreme Court would be interested in things relating to England and Wales, but we're not involved in that. We're talking about the Scottish people in the Scottish Parliament.
But maybe that's why Salvo have gone down the international route, perhaps, because they've had the same experience as you, trying to deal with it domestically. I don't know. I'm just supposing.
Well, I don't know either, and I don't know why we should go to international court when we don't go to. I mean, I would have thought that the international court would say to us in Scotland, well, why don't you use your own legal system? Scotland has its own legal system, separate from the English legal system. So why don't you use it? Why don't your Parliament use it, particularly if it has the power? Now,
so what do you? Let's assume everything you've said tonight is absolutely spot on, Andy, and I hope it is. Let's assume all of that. What's your next step if the Scottish Parliament refuse to deal with it, and the First Minister won't return your phone calls and letters?
Well, let's get back to the fundamental point. Everybody agrees, including many of the people with whom we are discussing this, that the Scottish people are in fact sovereign. They are the supreme sovereign authority in Scotland. If that is the case, then clearly they are the people who in the end will make a decision. If the Scottish
I think that stands to reason, but on what basis do you, if only you and a handful of others regard, or maybe a few thousand or 100,000 or a couple of million or 5 million or 3 million or 2 million believe that the Scottish people are sovereign, but Westminster doesn't, where does that take you?
Right. Now that's interesting, because it leads to the second point of what we are planning to do. We recognise that having a very good argument and being able to explain that something should be done doesn't necessarily mean that it will be done. That there are people who will ignore a very good argument and will not be prepared to deal with it. We recognise that. So the second line of our approach is to establish a grassroots movement right throughout Scotland, because that's the thing that will put pressure on people who are prepared to ignore us, not answer the questions, and not deal with it, although they're being paid to represent us, not do their job. Now, what we'll change that is to get people motivated right throughout Scotland and across Scotland.
Yeah.
We're doing that in a way which is somewhat different to what has been done up to now with other organisations. And I'll explain that if you...
Yeah, please.
Well, what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a bottoms-up organisation, an organisation that is based in the local community and is built from the top, so that the power, the decision-making power and the finances of the organisation is retained in the roots, in the ground. And the top of the organisation is a means of providing research, information, communication, networks, but it's not a demand situation. The demands don't come from the top, and the organisation gets its demands from the bottom, based on a common programme of what you're after. If you have a common programme, then you allow the units, and small units in our view, in each of the wards, you allow them to have the autonomy to proceed, provided they agree with the basic principles of the organisation and accept basic rules of democracy and equality and racial and sexual equality, etc.
Yeah. So I want to deal with some of that in a second. But Julie Brown is asking, how does she get in touch with your organisation?
Yeah, well, we're just completing we've only just been established, to be honest, and we just completed a website.
Yeah.
And what we're doing is we're going to get in touch. We've used the online to get in touch with a lot of people. Like nearly 300 people, 270, signed the letter that we sent to the First Minister. So we've done that online. But that's not our main method. Our main method is that we're going to be going around the doors, putting leaflets in the doorsteps in the local areas.
So just to answer Julie's question, how can she get more information about what you're doing?
Get it online now because the news website's been set up.
And what's the address of your website?
It's www. Scottish Respect Scottish Sovereignty.
Respect Scottish Sovereignty. Okay.
I think it's .scot.
That's quite a mouthful, .scot. But anyway, maybe our producer Kevin can stick it up later on the show.
Yeah, I think that's what it is. It's only just been.
It's just up. Okay. Well, everyone, I beg your indulgence because the website, all websites when they're starting off can be a little bit problematic. So bear with Andy. There you. It's up on the screen now. RespectScottishSovereignty.scot. Try that and see if that works for you. That's a way of getting in touch. So let me just go through some of the processes here. I'm not doing this from a sort of critical perspective, Andy. Let me reassure you. I'm just trying to tease out because I've been where you are just now on a number of occasions. I set up the Scottish Independence Convention way back when. It was not easy, and yet we had a huge advantage, in that we touched a chord in the nation's psyche, and it made it relatively straightforward. The difficulties come in the second phase, i.e., it's not hugely difficult to enthuse Scots about sovereignty and independence. That tends to be fairly straightforward. Yeah. The hard bit is the organisation dealing with the political parties, and also to ensure that there's regular communication, and also you're dealing with a media that is not conducive to debate.
Absolutely.
It's been infantilized and reduced to such a degree that it's run by people of very modest abilities, who in turn have hired people with even fewer ability. And the result is that it's well now impossible to get any form of reasonable debate going. We're probably doing more tonight than the BBC has done for the last month, typically. And when it comes to seeking information without being damning about one group or another. So I ask this from the spirit of wanting to help if I can, in however limited way. Let me just ask this question directly. When you set up these local groups, how do these local groups interface?
Right. Yeah. Well, the reason why you're absolutely right that we're facing the problems with the media. You're absolutely right that even if we've got an excellent case, we're not necessarily going to get anywhere unless we've got a force behind it. And the idea that we should contact people at local level and get a local-based organisation going is fundamental, in our view, to achieving success in this struggle. My thoughts on that go back to my experience in the Skybridge campaign, and when I got involved, and I got involved right from the very start in the Skybridge campaign because I was living in Skye at the time. And my background as a trade union official was organisations which are centred, the centre makes the decisions and spreads them out, like most organisations, like political parties. So that was my experience. And I was living in an area in Skye where the people were scattered over a huge area and there was a relatively small number of them. So how do you manage to organise that from the top down and get to all of these people? How do you even get people together? There was only 8,000 people in Skye and Lacars. And how could we get them together and communicate? It was very difficult. So by accident rather than design, I discovered that in Skye they had a very good communication themselves, a natural way of communicating, and that they had for a long time. And the small communities got together and communicated through a network system, and eventually you could get things dealt with very effectively. But a lot of the decision making was made at local levels.
Yes.
And it came through and eventually was adjusted. So the organisation that we set up in Skye to fight the Skye Bridge organised itself that way around, not by design. I mean, some of us who were in the leadership didn't realise that that was how to organise, but we found that it was. That's how to be organised in Skye, and it worked very effectively.
Yeah.
I learned a lesson from that. And I realized that if you're going to have an organization that's effective, instead of trying to get all the leadership at the top and all the brains and all the decisions, and then trying to discipline that across a whole lot of people, why not have a basic set of ideas which everybody attributes to? You need that. And you need to have a very good, clear argument to defend. You need that, and you need the research, and you need all that you need to do at the top. But you don't need that in terms of the organisation of pushing the pressure forward.
Yeah.
You can much better do that at local level. So build a local structure, and a local structure which feels in control of its organisation. So that because particularly with young people, if you're setting up a local structure and you're asking young people to go around the doors and collect petition signatures and do other things, you then got to give them control over their unit and their people and what they're doing. And if you do that, you then find that they become very active and pass up. Ideas go both ways. They pass up ideas and ideas come down. So that's the idea. Whether it will work on a much bigger scale than it worked in Skye is another matter. But that's the idea.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that. That's commendable. I think it is difficult to do it in a larger scale. And the reason I say that, we've got some feedback for which I apologise. The reason I say that is because of the grossly over-centralised nature of Scotland nowadays. I mean, it used to be the case that well, in fact, you could argue it's never been truly the case, but certainly more recently, we have a grossly over-centralised Westminster operation, and which has given birth to a Scottish version of the same. Where large local authorities dispense services down the way.
Yes,
it's very difficult to get anything coming up the way, because the whole setup is dominated by this ethos that says there has to be some guy at the top who understands all of this far better than you, even though you may be paying for it. And you are the person who's in receipt of its services.
And we've become conditioned to that.
That's right.
Become conditioned to that, and that's one of the problems. But I mean, as I say, I learned that a different experience, not by design but by accident. And I think, and I realised how powerful that is.
It is powerful.
After all, 8,000 people. We defeated the British government. We defeated the Scottish government, and we proved all the lawyers wrong that couldn't win, and we won. And we had an effect on the rest of Scotland with bridges and other things. So a small group of people, if they're determined, The other side, the unionists are the British establishment is very determined. We've got to be just as determined and better organised.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. It does seem to me, though, that you've got a major task on your hands. I mean, I wish you all the very best. It's just simply based on my own experience of sometimes it feels like the labours of Sisyphus. You get the rock some way up the hill and it rolls back on your big toe. But it does. I mean, it seems to me that what you're proposing is the only effective way forward here. But you'll be doing it, as you said, in the teeth of just about everyone out there because they have so much to lose. You have so much to gain. The Scottish people have so much to gain, but the Scottish people are constantly being told that they're not worthy. And if somebody says this to you for a number of decades, it's very hard to resist it.
Yes.
And particularly when things go wrong, this is put down not to any other reason, but a genetic incapacity to deal with things. I think a Labour MSP said that some time ago. She said that Scots were genetically incapable of running a government. And I'm not saying Labour people share that, but now it was a reprehensible thing to say. It sounds racist, in fact. But I suspect underneath the gloss of the Labour Party, that feeling is probably still there. I hope I'm wrong, but when I look at their behaviour, it leads me to believe that many of them still espouse that view.
Yeah, and I'm sure they do. And strange enough, I mean, the reality, I mean, obviously that is a racist approach to the issue, but it's perhaps there's a fundamental fact here that people do get conditioned to particular situations, and the Scots have perhaps got conditioned to getting instructions from the top and not challenging it, and not being able to challenge it, and not having a means. And if you're like that for a period of time, you get used to it. And there may be a factor here. I'm sure there is a factor here, in terms of the Scottish people and how they're responding. But that's something that can be changed. And it can be changed as soon as what is necessary and what we found in Skye. Look, during the 9.5 years we fought in Skye, there were lots of severe disappointments, a lot of difficulties. We lost case after case in the courts. We got condemned, we got divided, they got us split up, the media attacked us up consistently. It was difficult during that period. There were many, many difficulties. But one of the things that kept the thing alive was that all the time, for me anyway, was to see how people kept getting involved. The younger people kept coming in. We kept getting new ones. And we had half the population at one time were being pursued legally and otherwise because of this. I mean, I remember, what's his name, the Charles Kennedy saying in Parliament that he had more criminals in one little island of his area than the whole, than the average, anywhere else in the world, and because people got involved. But that involvement of people created an energy which was tremendous. And if you got a bit of that, just a quarter of that in Scotland, we'd have independence tomorrow.
Some people have argued that one way forward when you're dealing with a big project like this is to get little victories along the way, and to publicise those victories. What would you regard as being a small victory on the way?
Well, that's why we're focusing on this particular issue, because if you pursue this issue, the Scottish government could win this one tomorrow, and win it in the same way as they put through the rights for the child. That was a small victory. it means that Scottish children have got more rights than kids elsewhere in the UK. Not a good thing for other kids, but an important thing for Scotland,
Yeah.
and an important victory. Now, another victory like that, but more substantial, would be to push through this other legislation, albeit that we'll have to fight with the UK Supreme Court. I always find it actually strange. There's a UK Supreme Court, but there's no other UK court because we don't have a UK law, But we're talking about an English court, that follows English rules. So, yes, we'll get trouble from them. Of course we will, but we'll overcome it. And if we overcome that and we win this and we get this into legislation, that will be a small victory. Won't be the end, but it will be an important victory because we can then give the people their rights to have a say. And once the Scottish people have a right to have a say, we've won independence, because that's what independence is all about.
Yes, that's right. I always found it rather odd that the Scottish government chose to go to the Supreme Court and ask it how it felt about sovereignty. I always thought that was a very odd thing to do for two reasons. One is the principle of it. You're effectively saying to a group of people that you wish to have no part in, how do you feel about me saying I don't want any part in this? And just as importantly, I know because I've interviewed him that this whole notion was put earlier by a private individual, and he said he cautioned against the Scottish government doing exactly what they did.
Yeah.
And he said, I hope I'm not paraphrasing too much, but I think his point was, he said, I did it just to test the waters, but when a government does it, it has a very different character, and it rather suggests that the government that was supplicating itself before the Supreme Court had already effectively given away the argument, because it was saying, look, we accept you as supreme.
Yeah, absolutely.
The whole point is to say you're not supreme, the people are supreme.
And a Scottish lawyer leading in that, a Scottish lawyer, politician leading in that process, and then accepting that respect for the court decision. The court decision, was, in the first, it should never have been there. It should never have been there. Should never have been talking about that issue. And in any event, it's not relevant to the central point, because the court decision was the powers of the Scottish government in relation to the Scotland Act. What we're arguing is perfectly clear. It has nothing to do with the Scotland Act. The Scotland Act is clear, and therefore the UK Supreme Court has no role in this one.
Yeah, well, I think it was a very perplexing thing to do, and I didn't understand the logic of it. And I also felt that it rather it put the Scottish people in an invidious position, that their government was to a large degree kowtowing to a legal structure which it proposed to have no further part in. I always found that was a very odd position to take. Didn't make a lot of sense, and it ended up with the only decision they could have taken, which is, right now we're reading the Scotland Act. We all agree this is what's relevant here, and based on our reading of the Act, you have to go away and think again. Yeah. So it seems to be that the approach that you're taking. I mean, there is one question that it raises. Let's assume that you're successful, and I hope you are. But let's assume that you are successful. Don't you still have the same problem that the currency group and others have? How do you get international recognition?
Right. Well, I was involved with Tim Rideout at the start of setting up the currency group. So I've been involved with the currency group. The currency group has moved a tremendous way from where they were when they first started, and they're now very influential in Scotland, and rightly so. But the currency group started on the basis of finding a similarity among a wide group of people who had different economic views about currency and about economics.
Yeah.
Managed to pull that together around a certain number of themes.
Yeah.
That's how it tied itself in, and that's how it's been operating, and that's how it's been so successful. I think the same, and when they've not been successful in winning over the government. That's right, they've not been successful in convincing the SNP leadership that they should move away from the pound sterling. Uh, but we'll leave that to one side, because in a couple of years' time, I think the pound sterling is going to be in real trouble.
Yeah.
And so all the people who are now defending it will be looking to explain why their position is. So that's another issue. I think the currency group are doing an important job, and they're doing it at the right time, and they're doing the basic work, and it will be to Scotland's advantage that they've done that, because the political leadership have done nothing. They've sat on it and done nothing. So the currency group is a good example. But
Here's an interesting point. Why is the Scottish independence leadership so anodyne?
Well, I don't know the answer to that, but having been many years in the trade union movement, and having disappointment, I was in the Labour Party for years. I remember collecting money and giving it to Harold Wilson, shaking his hand and giving him a £5 note from the miners, and thinking, oh, we've done a great job and we're going great places. Well, we didn't go great places, and the only Labour Party that really successfully did their job, I think, was the Attlee government after the war. And since that, Labour has completely lost its position, and now it's indistinguishable from the Tories.
Yeah.
So I went through those disappointments over the years. In my earlier years, I was foolish enough to think that politicians were going to do things for us and were going to achieve great things. I realised afterwards that wasn't the case, that the miners themselves would have to do things for themselves. The miners had terrible conditions, and they were treated like dirt, and they had to do it for themselves. That's the way I moved. Now, the same is true today. Politicians don't make waves; they ride other people's waves.
Yeah.
So we will get nothing from the politicians. There'll be the pressure from not because they as individuals have anything wrong with them, but because they are in a position where the pressures that they get are from all the powerful lobby groups, from all the financial institutions, and the pressure is so great on the media, of course, and the pressure is so great on them that they don't have time to look around and see options. But if they get something coming up from the floor, if they get the wave being built, then they can operate differently. So our job is to make the wave.
Yeah. Well, let me stop a wave that's taking place. The woman's name you all need to know is not Kisa Dugdale. It's Joanne Lamont. Was the author of that pernicious comment that says Scots were genetically incapable of running their own affairs. I'm not sure if she's still in politics. One would desperately hope not. But yeah, you have your grassroots organisation. It's starting to grow. You will encounter enormous opposition from the media, and there almost seems to be a symbiotic relationship between the politicians in Scotland and the media. In other words, what the politicians kowtow to the media in a way that, again, I find difficult to understand. I mean, I appreciate that politicians complaining about the media is a bit like a sailor complaining about the sea. That's that old cliche. But nonetheless, sometimes you're in the wrong ocean and you need to change your mindset. And it seems to me that that's one of the anodyne or less progressive elements that I see, characteristics rather, that I see when I watch affairs in Scotland is the inability of the government in Scotland to take the media to task in a way that happens at Westminster. I mean, it would be unheard of for the BBC to go out on a limb and criticise the Westminster government. I mean, because all that would happen would be that the government could then rejig the BBC governorship and eject the old members and replace them with their own hacks. A bit like they're planning to do in the House of Lords.
Yeah. I mean,
It's pathetic. It's, in other words, we're going to have things run by people who are not elected. Seems to be a mantra.
Yeah.
Very odd in a democracy. Well,
Well,
maybe that's the problem.
Democracy. Is it a democracy? I mean, one of the interesting things about why is it, for example, I've given it some thought as to why did having accepted, let's say, the rights of the child legislation from the UN, the English government, the British government accepted it, but they didn't put it into English law. And this is true of a number of human rights aspects. And I looked after that and thought to myself, well, why is that? Why didn't they go ahead with putting that straight into legislation? And then the one thing struck me, that when I looked at these different conventions, all the references to democracy, to either representative democracy or direct democracy, there's no reference to monarchy. Huh? So one of the reasons you've got a problem in England is you've still got a system of sovereignty, which is feudal. The people in England don't have a role at all in sovereignty. Now that's important, because if they try to bring in UN legislation, it could clash with their fundamental legal position. So that's a question we have to ask ourselves. Is there a democracy in the UK? Is the king in parliament a democratic idea? The
crown in parliament is just a device to cover the
establishment.
The cardinal thing is that the UK Parliament determines everything.
Yes.
It is sovereign in the UK. The only sovereign group that's recognised, the only sovereignty that's recognised in the UK, is not the monarchy. It's the Crown and Parliament, which is Parliament. Parliament regards itself as sovereign, and of course, because there's no written constitution, it means it can literally act as it wishes,
and it can adjust what the sovereign is.
Well,
it certainly is not.
Well, it can do crazy things. It can say things like, as Keir Starmer said, when the controversy blew up over taking gifts, it can say, well, I'll tell you what, there was nothing wrong with that, but I've decided to strengthen the rules. You think, well, hold on a second, there's nothing wrong. Why do you have to strengthen the rules? Okay, but you accept that twisted logic because that's commonplace in the UK. So you accept this nonsense and you say, okay, so who's going to draw up the rules? Well, I am. But hold on a second, that was the problem in the first place, is that you drew up the rules.
Yeah, exactly.
There's nobody else to draw up the rules. That's the reality of it.
Yeah,
if you had a constitution, you could say, all of you report to the sovereign people, and the sovereign people will decide who sets the rules.
For example, John, if we were to get in the Scottish Parliament, if we were to put through this legislation for the civil and political rights, the people could then have a referendum on the question of drawing up a constitution. And if that constitution went through the Scottish Parliament, and if the Scottish Parliament put it, the only thing to stop it is the royal assent. But if the Scottish Parliament put it to a referendum, referendum in Scotland, in legal terms, is stronger than the royal assent, because the royal.
The basic clash in all of this, seems to me, and you've, as it were, underscored this, Andy, is that if one sticks to an essentially legal route here, it leads you to all sorts of difficulties and anomalies, if I can put it that way. You could have a situation where everyone in Scotland wanted a particular act, but because it didn't get the royal assent, it failed.
But well, can you have that? Can you have that in Scottish law? Is that the case in Scottish law?
I don't know.
Well,
But if what you said earlier is accurate, that any act in the Scottish Parliament doesn't become law unless it has the royal assent, then that would suggest that that's the case.
but that's because that's what's written into the Parliament Act, the Scotland Act. That's written in there. So the Scottish Parliament operates within the Scotland Act. But if it's never been disputed, certainly not by the UK Supreme Court, that that sovereignty in Scotland rests with the people, and in particular, the removal.
How can you have that? You can't have two sovereigns.
That's right, exactly. You cannot have two sovereigns. So if the sovereignty rests with the people, you cannot have another sovereign.
No,
that sovereignty that they're referring to is relating to English sovereignty. It's the concept of English sovereignty.
But hold on a second. Let's examine the reality.
Right.
I understand the theory, but as we discussed earlier, if the politicians in Scotland accept not your version, but the Westminster version, then they're effectively denying the sovereignty of the Scottish people.
Yes, but that would mean that they, as individuals, are denying. They're doing it now.
Yes,
they're doing that now, but because they accepted that a Tory minister could prevent a decision made by the Scottish Parliament from getting the royal assent. So the royal assent was then in the hands of a Tory minister,
yes,
not the king. And
that's true. That's true. That's always been the case.
Yeah, and that is accepted. That was accepted.
Yeah.
If that means that they did accept that view, but that doesn't mean that the substance of the argument of the sovereignty rests there, because it doesn't rest in their hands. It rests in the people's hands. Now, that needs to be challenged, has to be challenged.
Yeah.
And if we go back to the just before the Union, when they wanted both Scotland, the establishment in Scotland and in England wanted rid of the Stuarts. They both wanted to do the same. England's route to get rid of the Stuart, or get rid of James, was that they argued that he had deserted the throne and had left London and deserted the throne. They didn't argue that they had the power to remove him. They kept the concept of the king in Parliament valid by claiming that, well, he abdicated, so we had to find another one.
Yeah.
That wasn't the argument in Scotland. The argument in Scotland was he didn't perform his duties in line with his constitutional duties to the Scottish people, and the Scottish people removed him. That was a significant difference in law, and it still applies.
Well, it'll be interesting to see all this worked out. Let's give you a plug for your meeting on Friday. You're talking at the Bacchus Bar in Glasgow at 2 p.m. this Friday.
Yes,
there you are. And you'll be addressing the Pensioners for Independence group. Is that right? That's
right. Yeah.
And will you be taking questions?
Oh yes. Much of the time will be questions.
Good. And what do you intend should happen as a result of your meeting on Friday?
Well, I mean, that meeting is just one of a number of meetings that I'm planning to have up and down the country.
Okay.
It's just to spread the ideas. It's not to do the practical work. We're doing the practical work separate from that.
Okay. This has been interesting. I've learned a lot. I would love to have somebody on the programme from the Scottish Government to tell us, or the Scottish Parliament for that matter, to tell us why they don't agree with what you've just been saying. Because I think we need that voice in the debate.
Yes.
We need to hear from somebody who is opposed to what you're doing in order we can establish what the heck is going on here and how to evaluate all of this.
Well, absolutely, because no answer isn't a response.
No, it's not. It's an avoidance of a response.
You've got to have a response.
Yeah, that's very disappointing. I have to say, in trying to get the Scottish government interested in a written constitution, I experienced much of that frustration in that I found I was dealing with people who really didn't understand what was being addressed. And it was only through the good offices of Mike Russell that things actually got on the table. But the fact of the matter is, it was done without any great enthusiasm that I detected from the Scottish Government. And when I asked the Constitution Secretary to come on the show and talk about such matters, he turned us down flat and said, that's not something I would like to do, John. So in other words, the Constitution Secretary did not want to talk about the Constitution. As they say in the States, go figure. What the heck does that mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's see how you get on with these various groups. We'd love to have somebody on from like I said, the government or the Scottish Parliament to tell us why they don't think this is what you're suggesting is a good idea.
Yeah.
But I fear, I hope I'm wrong, but I would love it if somebody could come on and tell me I'm wrong. I fear that the present crop of politicians, particularly in the SNP, is wedded to the notion of devolution.
Yeah. Yes.
They call themselves a national party, but I think that they deep at the heart, they see themselves as a devolution party.
Yeah, absolutely. But let me issue a challenge to the SNP leadership. Come and debate this. Come and discuss it. You may be right. I may be wrong, but come and discuss it and look at the issue in detail and see where we stand. Don't hide away and pretend.
The reality is, in today's world, you can't hide away.
You can't.
You just can't.
Exactly.
I mean, this notion that you can cower from the world and hope the world will pass you by is just a complete nonsense. If you sit there cowering in a corner, the world will come to you.
Absolutely, John.
And when that happens, you do not meet on equal terms. You meet on a very poor set of terms indeed. So you're far better off going to engage with the world on your terms and making a decent fist of it. Anyway, so there we are. As you can see, we're almost have to wrap up now, but tune in next week for Anna Ake, who's a Catalan activist and journalist, and she's involved with the International Commission on European Citizens. So since we've almost run out of time, Andy, it only remains for me to say thank you sincerely, very much indeed. And I wish you and your colleagues every success. And I hope that thousands turn up at the Bacchus Bar tomorrow on Friday at 2:00 to hear you speak about demanding our UN rights. Thanks again, Andy.
Thank you, John.
Everyone watching and listening, look after each other. Stay safe.
Good
night.
Cheerio.